My name is Barbara. I'm design director at IDEO Munich. I joined the studio about 8.5 years ago, actually coming from Alto. Back in the days I joined as product design intern. I was studying industrial and strategic design at Alto University. And then from coming in as a product designer, I discovered design research. And now I'm a design researcher here, and I do a lot of projects in the space of service design and sort of like system challenges.
Cool. I'm Akshan. I originally come from India. I studied computer science engineering and graphic design later on, also that from India. I am currently a design lead, focusing on research and interaction design. I've been at IDEO for around 4 years, and most of my projects are at the intersection of how technology influences people, or how people use technology, and how we can design that in a more inclusive way. I guess for us, the definition of diversity is something around enhancing our vision of the world, thinking about the nuances and kind of gathering a more broader understanding of the world that we operate in, rather than operating from our existing tunnel vision, like trying to see different points of view and including that into the design process.
Mm-hmm. And as we're both design researchers, we believe, or at IDEO, we believe that design research plays a very important role in bringing diversity to projects and bringing diversity to the design process. What we do as design researchers is that we, as we say, we lead with empathy. So we uncover people's needs. We help our clients understand their customers and their future customers' needs today and in the future, and how they might differ. And also, very importantly, we inspire teams.
Yeah.
So we're not just there to bring hard facts in, but we're also there to really provide different kinds of points of view and stimulus into the design process. And throughout a project, continuously advocate for the users, or for the people's needs and their viewpoints.
Yeah, and that oftentimes might mean that we very intentionally try and find people whose opinions are very different, people and places, and we try to visit these places and people at their homes or in their workspaces where they feel most comfortable sharing their opinions with us, and trying to bring that back into our project spaces or into our clients' boardrooms, and trying to make them aware of, people who they might not ever have spoken with otherwise or have heard otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Oftentimes this also means that we speak to extreme users, as we call them. So we're not necessarily talking so much to the 95% of consumers maybe who share a very common set of needs or features or behaviors, but looking more on the edges, which is maybe not representative, but very inspiring, and can break some of the preconceptions or some of the preconceived notions that people in general might have, that we might have, or that our clients might have. I think we've both seen some very nice examples in the past of where you could see bringing some more extreme voices that suddenly burst a bubble, or like broke some of these ideas that people had in their head, and they came to realize, like, whoa, this is really not who we thought that our users were, or this is not how we thought that our users would use our product or behave.
Oftentimes the organizations that we work for have a very sort of narrow point of view on who their customer is. Like, they know their customer when they walk into their store and the purchasing behavior, but they have no idea how this person lives, or where they live, who are the people they interact with, what they might think about certain different issues, and what is the influence of all of that on their actual behavior that matters to the businesses. So also bringing that point of view. I mean, all of us are, humans who come with certain backgrounds and certain baggage, right? We have a way of seeing the world. We have grown up in certain contexts, and we bring all of that into our project space. And that is how we perceive the world. Like, I would never be able to understand how a cancer patient in their last, few months of their life, or actually the family of that cancer patient might feel or might think about, or they just might have a very different life than I can ever imagine, right? So that's what I mean by tunnel vision. Like, the way I perceive the world will be very different to the way somebody else with other backgrounds might perceive the world. And trying to have an open dialogue with them and trying to be genuinely curious and genuinely interested in how they live their lives and how they see the world just helps us be much more humble and be much more realistic about our design, right?
I think the first step is already when we plan research and we bring in the proposal to our client that, we'll talk to 6 to 8 people in a market, for example. 6 to 8 people sounds like a very small number, and most clients will tell you, but that is in no way representative, right? And we're not trying to be representative, that's the point. We're trying to inspire, we're trying to uncover some very overseen needs, maybe, and so especially at the early stages of a project, representation of the majority of your customer base is not what we're trying to do. That is typically done through more quantitative market research, and that is not what we take on. And then part of those 6 to 8 maybe users, if you want to take that number, might be extreme users. So that's another new idea to bring in. And one thing that helps, I think, in bringing those voices to the table is to include our clients into the research and actually take them with us, so that sometimes you hear them use a language like, oh, that freak, was using this and that. That's a very judgmental way of talking about people who show more extreme behaviors. But when you take them into the field, into the research, and they understand that that freak actually has a name and has a life and maybe has a family and has motivations that suddenly seem to make a whole lot more sense because they understand the context and so on. They're no longer talking about them as freaks, but they're acknowledging them as people who also play a role, who might also choose to be their customers, although they didn't think about them in the first place. And then these opinions and these behaviors that you observe there become very important and are oftentimes actually the stories that get referenced by our clients the most. Because they just suddenly broaden up that spectrum and they see that, yeah, right, we're not just designing for the middle, or we might be designing for the middle, but because we capture the ends or the side bits as well. And apart from, I think, taking clients into the field and seeing that firsthand, storytelling plays a huge role. So the role of the researcher and the entire design team is not to uncover only the needs, but to play them back in an inspiring and engaging way. That can be through simple quotes, if they're well done or well brought back. That can be through video and photo material. That can sometimes be through illustrations, if it's a very sensitive topic and you can't show the participants in video material and so on. But it has to be something that can also live on and can be shareable in an organization. So that these stories, again, don't just, stand on paper somewhere, but are actually underpinned with people's faces and characters and so on.
For me, like, the reason that it's really important to bring people into the design process and to design not just for your tunnel vision, but a broader sort of audience, is from an ethical standpoint. It's just that a lot of technology-enabled services are very exclusive in the way that they're designed. They do not necessarily take into consideration that there are people with different needs and different contexts, like we described. So there's something about creating technology-enabled services that are accessible to everybody, right? Making that happen is difficult because we kind of get caught up in our sort of like bubbles or make assumptions about how people live their lives. One example I can think about is Flipkart, which is an online retailer in India, which for the longest time was the reason Amazon did not enter the Indian market, is because they really understood the sort of like the behavior in India which prevailed at that time, which was a lot of fear of like online payments and frankly not a lot of people using credit cards. So they pioneered this idea of cash on delivery. So they built like a trust mechanism online where you could order something and people, like the delivery person would come and then you would pay cash and then you would get the thing. So you would not actually go through the purchasing or the payment part online. And that has now been copied by, for example, Uber and all of these other services that we do now, because that's just a prevalent behavior in that context.
And I guess also the Flipkart example shows that, whilst we might think about it as an ethical behavior or a prerequisite or something that we think that we have to follow from an ethical point of view, obviously the flip side of it is a business reason. I mean, none of our clients probably would say, like, from an ethical standpoint, we have to be inclusive and now we also have to tap into this market. But the reason behind it is usually that you want to open up new markets in other places. And I read a really, really nice example not long ago in a book that I can highly recommend from Hans Rosling, Factfulness, where he writes about the producer of a menstrual pad and how in many companies you would first look into specializing and creating more products, a bigger product variety within the market that you're already very comfortable in. So for menstrual pad, you would now design the bikini version or, for the businesswoman or whatever it is, but you would still be targeting the same group. But if you actually understood that there are markets that are untapped with great needs and with very different behaviors, so looking at certain underdeveloped markets maybe, but where a health standard has now been achieved, looking at some more rural areas, for example, in Africa, what would it actually mean to understand their needs? Your market opportunity from the bikini version and, the businesswoman would suddenly go into millions and millions of people who are not yet users. So obviously, as I said, next to the ethical reason, there's a huge business reason for why you should be more inclusive and think in more diverse ways.
And honestly, like, there's something like really sweet about finding that spot where you're able to sort of design or build something for people who have needs that have not been met yet, but at the same time you can turn that into a sustainable business. I think there's something really like joyful about that, which is a very human thing that you cannot take away, I guess.
And it's kind of nice, I think, that we've seen some of this behavior from some of the big technology companies also and formerly startups coming from Silicon Valley, where they were designing for a very specific, very developed user base, very much like you and I, the millennials of this world, and later came to understand that now we have a certain size, now we have maybe also the luxury to be more inclusive and think about people who are maybe not as digitally knowledgeable or fluent, and how can we include them into our product and so on. So I think it's whether you're an established big company or you're a startup, there will come that point where either from an ethical point of view or from a business point of view, you will question, like, okay, is the market that we're reaching right now, and are the users that we're maybe understanding the only ones that we should understand and cater to? And we usually help them do that. The first point goes back to what we touched upon in the beginning. So we say we lead with empathy. What does that mean? I mean, you can only have empathy for people that you have been exposed to, either directly or indirectly through the storytelling and so on. So once we understand people holistically in their needs, we can develop empathy for them and design for them and so on. So one of the things that we tend to do in our projects, and is often also asked for by our clients, is that we take them with us into the field and we expose them to the context in which people live. And when we say the client, it's a big term, right? What does that actually mean? That can be senior executives, that can be people who work on the front line. So it might be that you're actually taking, a sales associate who typically works with customers to meet their customers in a very different context, not at the desk where you usually serve them, but maybe at their homes. So taking them with us is a great way to break some of these preconceived notions. And I had a really wonderful example a few weeks ago only, where I was working with a client in the luxury and fashion environment. So their end customers are people who typically spend a decent amount of money, let's say, on luxury goods, fashion, jewelry, and so on and so forth. And we did global research. We went to France, we went to the United States, and we also went to China. We did research in Beijing, and we took our client with us. And we went to people's homes and met them. And we were sitting in this very decorated living room of a woman who spends around 50,000 euros per month on luxury goods from jewelry and fashion. And looking around us, although it was very decorated, there was like wallpaper coming off the wall. It was all fake. None of the materials in the apartment were real. It looked like marble, but it wasn't marble. The chandelier was made from plastic, and so on and so forth. And seeing that this is a customer who, on the one hand side, spends so much money on certain things in life, but on the other hand, lives in a context that in France, for example, you would never see. That just completely broke the idea of who this client's customers are. And seeing this light bulb go off in our client's face was just like, oh my God, like we thought we knew who we were working for, but this we never expected.
Yeah, I mean, there's also this sort of idea of creating the persona, right? Like you create a user persona and then you design for that user persona, but it's usually a very idealistic version of who you think your user is going to be. But then the moment you step into their house, like I remember, for example, taking a client with me. I was working on a project with respect to diabetes. So we went into this person's house, and the persona was like this person who wants to try and get better, right? Or like want to try and get healthy. And she's got all the medication. She brings out this box full of like all her insulin and medication. She's got a diary and everything like perfect. You would imagine this is the perfect patient. We asked her to open her fridge. And then when she opens the fridge, there's just insulin and Coca-Cola, right? Like the entire fridge is just that. So then you kind of like, the client walks in and is like, okay, that's interesting. I wasn't expecting that. And there's just like this, like Barbara was mentioning, like this light bulb moment going off and realizing, I think in essence, realizing that people aren't perfect and you can't categorize them into one box. They have different sort of characteristics that you have to account for and design for, and they behave differently in different contexts.
Yeah. The other thing that in order to bring diversity to the table, I think what we can do is ourselves hire a diverse team, but also encourage our clients to bring diverse teams to the table, and also to the decision making and so on. And sometimes we help our clients write role descriptions or help them actually hire when we realize that the current setup does not enable them to have more diverse points of views. Then we can also do that.
And recently, some of our work has also been somehow, I don't think intentionally, but in unintentional ways, empowering leaders within the client organization who come from either diverse backgrounds or female, young, who you would not typically see. I'm sure you can vouch for that. Like when you walk into a client organization's boardroom, there's typically like white male, 60s, 50s, whatever, right? And suddenly there's like young leaders who are working with us and kind of stepping up the ladder, bringing this new thinking in, and showing results, right? So that's pretty awesome, actually.
I think that should also be our work if we understand not just what the organizational agenda is, but what the agenda is of, some of the maybe younger leaders that we still work with. We can help them achieve that through the work that we do together, and through the way that we can show results and so on. I think oftentimes we will be also asked to, put a team together that is very diverse. So especially from companies who recognize that their internal view is very homogeneous, we will often be asked to bring in different nationalities, to bring in very different profiles that can stir up the thinking a little bit. As Akshan mentioned, there was a project a couple years ago now where we were asked by a big Silicon Valley-based tech company to help them understand what the world outside looks like, because they were realizing that for the first 6 years of their existence or so, they had been more or less designing for people like them. And that was a very, very good market to start with. But they understood that that is not the market to stay with, because they had then reached almost the maximum capacity within that. And they were like, okay, so where do we go from here? We really don't understand the world. So we need to find a partner who has a more diverse way of looking at this. And interestingly enough, we have an office in San Francisco, right? But the project was not done out of San Francisco, it was done out of Munich to bring the European view into it, since the client was also in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. So that can happen as well.
And I'd love to piggyback on something you were saying. Like, I think we've been discussing this tension, between when you're trying to launch a product into the world, you have to have a relentless focus on the user, the target customer, and their user need, and how do you solve that? And that, by definition, you could argue is exclusive in that it only focuses on one kind of user. And on the other hand, that tension is basically that, you want to be more inclusive, you want to have a larger sort of market that you're addressing, different types of users and so on, but then you're much slower, and your product might be diluted because you're trying to address a lot of different needs. And yeah, I mean that's a great tension, but I guess the way we think about it now is, in the beginning when you're trying to launch a product, is to focus on learning. So use that target group or that target user to learn as much as you can, to validate all your assumptions. And then when you're scaling, to basically start to look at different user groups and start to grow your product in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's very true, that especially when you have an early stage project, that we will encourage you to slice the pie smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and be very precise about who you're trying to address. Because the risk is that if you don't do that, everything just becomes like vanilla. It's like just nothing very concrete. And then later, as you expand and you become more inclusive, that might mean that your product has maybe functionalities or filters or whatever, if we're talking digital, that are only relevant for, again, a slice of the pie. But because you have many of them, you can go much broader in your audience and so on. It just shouldn't be confused with what you do in the beginning and what you do later on. Mm-hmm. I think no startup would succeed if they were trying to design for the whole world in an inclusive way from the beginning.